afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Portland's Friday Forum. City Club is where civic-minded people come together to make Portland and Oregon a better place for everyone to live, work, and play. I'm Greg McPherson, president of City Club. Members and guests are gathered today at the Sentinel Hotel, along with all of you listening on OPB radio or watching on Portland Community Media. The generous support of City Club's corporate and media partners enables us to put on the state's best civic programs week after week. Our media partner is Oregon Business Magazine. Our current Friday Forum sponsors are AARP of Oregon, Barron Liebman, Iberdrola Renewables, Providence Health and Services, and Uber. Please join me in showing our appreciation for all of them. At next week's Friday Forum, a panel including Neil McFarland of TriMet, Vivian Satterfield, Deputy Director of Opal, an environmental advocacy group, and Carmen Four, advisor to Governor Kate Brown, will focus on the future of transportation in Portland. Please join us here at the Sentinel for this important discussion. You can learn more about City Club events, purchase tickets, and become a member on our website, pdxcityclub.org. As always, we will be live tweeting today's program. You can follow along and join the conversation using the hashtag PDXCityClub. Later in today's program, Jeff Mapes will facilitate a Q&A session with those in the live audience. Asking questions at the microphone is a benefit of City Club membership, but anyone in the live audience here at the Sentinel may write a question on one of the index cards found at the center of the tables. Hold the card up and City Club staff will collect them before or during the Q&A session. Following today's forum, City Club members will debate and vote on the street fee report. If you are a City Club member and did not receive a ballot when you arrived, please return to the registration table to be issued one. Ballots cannot be accepted in advance of the voting at the end of today's forum. Online voting will be open to all City Club members who do not cast a ballot today until Wednesday, September 16 at 10 a.m. And now for today's program. Portland's streets need work. As with many public needs, the challenge is not deciding what should be done, but figuring out how to pay for it. Last year, Mayor Charlie Hales and Commissioner Steve Novick launched a discussion of a potential new street fee to be paid by residents and by businesses located in the city. The City Council considered asking for an advisory vote on several versions of the street fee, but then dropped that idea. To advance the discussion, the City Club Research Committee studied the street fee for 7 months and this week issued its report, Portland Streets Ending the Funding Gridlock. Today's panel will consider the City Club report and discuss how this vexing problem can be solved to assure that Portland has safe and functional streets. Our panel today includes Steve Townsend, who has worked for the City of Portland for 19 years, the past 10 of those as city engineer with the Bureau of Transportation. John Horvick is Vice President and Political Director of DHM Research, a nonpartisan public opinion research firm specializing in policy and planning. Jennifer Rollins is a lawyer with the firm of Elliott, Ostrander & Preston, LLC, and chair of the City Club's Street Fee Research Committee. The discussion will be moderated by the Oregonian newspaper's senior political reporter, Jeff Mapes. Please welcome our panelists to Friday Forum.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and it's really a pleasure to be here. You know, this may sound like a little bit of a boring subject, street maintenance. What the heck is that? But actually, I have to tell you, this is really a fascinating subject. I just this week read the 92-page report from the City Club, and it's just sort of a fascinating political history. It reminded me of Robert Caro's masterpiece about Robert Moses, if anybody remembers The Power Broker. I mean, it's a very rich tale. And, you know, one thing maybe that might help to explain a little bit, bring this home, is I have my own little gruesome tale to tell. I think it's kind of analogous to what's going on here with our street maintenance problem in Portland, in that I've lived in my current house in Northeast Portland for about 10 or 11 years, and last year we had to spend an absolutely ungodly amount of money to take care of a dry rot problem in our garage underneath our house. We put enough steel in that place that I was, to shore it up, that I was kidding neighbors that I was I was going to build a 5-story condo there, which many of them believed, given the way Portland's going these days. But this was a problem that if I or previous homeowners had caught this a lot earlier, you know, it would have been a much different degree of problem. And reading this report really made me think of that. And as a matter of fact, I'd really kind of like to start the discussion here by asking Steve if he has a nice gruesome tale about street maintenance and the problem, and then just give us a quick overview of why this is something we should be concerned about.
Thanks, Jeff. I wanted to talk about a few things, kind of give you a little background on this. So I talked to our staff, and I'm actually going to build on what Jeff talked about. The way I kind of think about streets is they're a lot like your house and a lot like your roof. And if you think about that, if you keep a good roof on your house and you can keep the water out from, you know, getting under the roof and damaging the house, you're in good shape. And streets are a lot of the same way. The biggest enemy a lot of times is water. If we can keep water from getting through, we're in good shape. So it's kind of like your house. If your roof starts to leak and you're able to fix it right away, you're in pretty good shape. But if you wait too long, that water starts to cause other damage. In Jeff's case, dry rot, mold, other things. And if you wait too long making that repair, then you basically have to tear the house down and start over. Roads are exactly the same way. If I can do the preventative maintenance on it to keep the water out and getting too far down, I'm in good shape. And so we normally think of that as being the preventive maintenance where things start going a lot more expensive afterwards is what we call a 2-inch grind. And the way I kind of think about it is it's kind of resurfacing. It's taking that stuff that's bad on the surface and replacing it. So to give you an idea of things, and I'm going to talk about I'm going to talk about a few of the streets, and then I'll get back to that. But he asked me some streets that pop into my mind that are ones that you say, wow, these are really a problem. And a couple that just popped into my mind, aren't too far away from here, is Northwest 23rd. Northwest 23rd, you go up and down it, you see the issues. We fixed one phase from Burnside to Lovejoy, but from Lovejoy going farther out, you have problems. And about every winter, we get phone calls, and after a really hard rain, occasionally when a bus drives down, water squirts out of the pavement. It's a little fountain. And a couple others that always pop up into people's minds. There's parts of Capitol Highway that are bad, but also the ones we also get a lot of calls on is NATO Parkway at Market. So if you're on Market Street and you're going to get on I-5 southbound, you go right through that intersection that's in really poor shape. Now, building on that a little bit, as I go on, people are saying, well, what's the scope of the problem here? Okay? So to give you an idea, the city has 4,800 lane miles. And what a lane mile is, it's 1 lane wide, 12 feet wide, 1 mile long. And if I took that 4,800 lane miles and put them end to end and built a 1-lane road, with all the pavement in Portland, we could build a 1-lane road from Portland to Orlando, Florida, and back to Denver, Colorado. Think about that. Or another way is if you took them and you put them side by side, it would be a 26-lane freeway between Portland and Seattle. I one time mentioned that, and one of the elected officials thought I was advocating for a 26-lane freeway between Portland and Seattle, but that wasn't the case. So that gives you an idea of how many lane miles we have. We have the resources in the last couple of years to touch 100 miles. If we have 4,800 miles and we're only touching 100 miles a year, that means it's 48 years to get around the city. And those are only the ones we're touching are preventive maintenance, meaning they're a 2-inch grind or less, okay? And so anything that's already gotten worse, we're not touching. And so to give you an idea of where we are with things, I had our pavement manager run some numbers. And as of yesterday, when they printed things out, and again, they said there was 341 lane miles of busy streets that could qualify for a 2-inch grind based on the scores. Another 831 miles of locals. That would mean 1,175 lane miles qualify for a 2-inch grind based on their scores. That's almost 25% of our system. Remember, we have 4,800 and we're almost at 1,200. At a cost of 200,000 a lane mile, that's $235 million to repair just those streets. And if I go the next step down, and again, it's kind of like your house. If you wait too long, it gets more expensive. The deeper I have to do repair, the more expensive it gets. If I look at 3 to 4 inch grinds on the busy streets, it's 350 miles. It's another 517 on the locals for a grand total of 867 miles, estimating 500,000 a lane mile. Notice the jump. It would be 433 million to repair those. So just repair streets that are already at, we'd say, preventive maintenance or worse, and I'm not talking about streets that have gotten even worse than that, that's over $600 million.
All right, that's a big number. Jennifer, summarize a little bit what the City Club concluded in its report, and also why it was so difficult to reach a consensus. You were the chair of the committee, but you yourself were in the minority, so talk about that as well.
Well, actually, in spite of having a minority report, the committee overwhelmingly agreed on almost every issue. There's really just a minor point, and I'll be talking about that in the next section of the presentation. Overwhelmingly, we agree with what Steve has just said. Every time that this issue gets pushed off, it's going to cost more and more money to catch up. So I think the overwhelming message from the committee would be, do something now. Don't keep delaying the project. And I think the other thing that's so important to understand is that voters don't understand. I am a pretty well-informed person, and I came to this committee thinking, what is wrong? Streets are one of the fundamental things that government should be providing to us. I don't mind paying taxes for extra things, but streets, really? Come on. It really took rolling up my sleeves, looking at the budget, understanding how little wiggle room the city has in its discretionary spending. And so yeah, the committee agreed on a gas tax as a potential way forward, looking at some new technologies to vehicle miles traveled, looking at parking, commuter taxes. The only area of disagreement was, and this should come as no surprise to anyone who's followed the debate at all, whether there should be some kind of a transportation utility fee. But I hope that what everyone takes away from here today is that everyone on the committee who looked at this for months and months and talked to dozens of people, we all agree that there's not enough money right now and that we shouldn't delay.
Okay, thank you. John, so a little bit maybe Jennifer stole your thunder about talking how she approached it as a voter, but why are voters so resistant to spending more money on roads when it's the one thing that we virtually all use?
Sure. Well, thanks. Before I answer that question, let me thank Jennifer and her committee for their excellent work on this report. Really fabulously done, well-researched, and incredibly well-written. So thank you for your service. To answer that question, let me try to take a step back first. And there's the phrase that all politics is local, but local politics doesn't happen in a vacuum either, right? There are factors outside of us that influence what our individuals think of what local communities can do, and a large part of that is the complexity of transportation funding. So there's federal, there's state, we have our regional government, we have county, and then we have local. What the public understands about each one of these parts is limited. What they understand about how they work together is minimal. And that's just sort of big picture, but then there's the individual funding mechanisms as well. What tax dollars go to what, whether it's a specific type of project or to what type of government. And just to give the most obvious example is the gas tax. That is a primary way we fund transportation here in the United States. But what is the gas tax? You ask the typical person, you're going to get sort of a blank stare. A big part of the reason for that is that we hide it. When you go somewhere that has a sales tax, you get the receipt and you see what the cost of the good was and what the sales tax was. The gas tax, we don't advertise what it is at the pump. You don't see it on your receipt. And so there's a it's hidden. People are not aware of what they're paying for. And as a public opinion researcher who spends a lot of my time traveling across the state and the country asking people about public policy issues, when they don't know what taxes they're paying, they assume that they're paying too much. That's sort of the natural response. And just to give you some data points from polling that I've done with regards to that, about once a year we ask Oregonians how much of every dollar that government spends do you feel is wasted, and how much of every dollar do you think government spends benefits your daily life? Well, Oregonians last year, on average, told us that 44 cents out of every dollar that government spends is wasted. So there's two parts, I think, to the puzzle. One is the complexity. Two is that people don't know. Three is that we're in a time, for many reasons, of cynicism and distrust of government. And we are in a moment of, I think, deep ignorance about how public policy works and how government works. And we can have a whole conversation, a whole Friday forum about why that is. But the fact of the matter is that that's the environment that we're trying to advance complicated public policy issues. Just a few data points, just to give you an example. In statewide surveys that I do in this last year, 50% of Oregonians cannot name the 3 branches of government. 50% cannot name how many United States senators represent the state. And in a city poll that I did, 15%, or excuse me, I asked Portlanders what percent of the city's transportation budget goes to the streetcar, and they estimated 15%. Now, Commissioner Novick is in the room. He probably can tell you what the number is. I don't know what it is off the top of my head, but it's less than 15%. And so there are many reasons, but I think part of the overall reason is that this is a complicated problem with many sorts of layers of transportation funding, within an environment where people are not well informed, and a presumption that government is not working well. And all those things combine together to make this a very, very difficult environment to have a conversation or to raise the necessary revenue to pay for the goods.
Okay, yeah, let's dig into that a little bit more. Steve, I mean, talk about this. Is this a matter of prioritizing spending? Can we revamp the budget process and the Portland Bureau of Transportation, or even the city more broadly, to emphasize maintenance, which, as Jennifer said, most people think, hey, that's a core service of government?
Well, first of all, I want to say the Portland City Club did a wonderful job in the report. I mean, the thoroughness to which they went to was amazing. And so with that, again, I want to thank the City Club for taking on this issue. And one of the things they did a good job of looking at was Portland's budget or transportation budget's around $300 million. And as they said, the need for maintenance and safety, and I just spoke earlier on maintenance, but one of the key things we need to be addressing in Portland is safety as well. And with that, we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But of that $300 million, 2/3 of it is dedicated to programs that it has to go to those areas. Of the remaining $100 million, about $70 million goes to maintenance. And of that $70 million, $13 million goes to street maintenance, and $1 million of that actually goes to fill potholes. Of the remaining money that goes to maintenance, it goes to structural maintenance and other things like that, signing, striping, but the vast majority of our maintenance budget goes to actually cleaning sewers and patching sewers. We're paid by our environmental services to do that. And when you look at the amount of money left, there's not much left in transportation, and so to try to come up with $205 million, it's not even close. And then they also did a great job, and like I said, I'd let Jennifer talk more about it, but they looked at city council, and with all the money in the general fund basically goes to fund police, fire, and parks. And if they were to have to cut $205 million from police, fire, and parks to come up with things, that would just be unprecedented and not sustainable.
Jennifer, if you could expand on that a little bit, and also talk about one thing that there has been is a shift over the last several years from maintenance to capital spending. When you went back and looked at sort of the history of what they've done there, did we go too far in various capital projects, and can we make some adjustments there?
I think that capital spending is a tricky question too. Nothing is a simple answer in this arena, but it's an increasing portion of the budget is going to paying debt service on capital projects. And I think, and Steve probably can correct me on the numbers, but it was around 8%, and it's going to double when some new projects kick in. On the flip side, I think that the people who are making those decisions would tell me that fine, we can do less capital projects, but we're going to miss out on federal funding. You know, a lot of that we have to match. I know that's the kind of choice that I've made in my personal life. You know, if someone's going to offer me free medical spending dollars, I'm going to go buy some fancy glasses. And if the federal government says we're going to come and offer you some money to build a streetcar, it's hard to say, no, we really should save our money and pave our streets. But I think as that the amount of money out of the transportation budget that's going to debt service increases, people are going to be called on to make that hard choice. But I think this is one thing that Kristen, the writer of our report, did a great job of illustrating, is that that's so unsatisfying to people. I mean, she says it specifically, if you maintain streets, no one notices. Everything looks just the same, and that's the goal. People really love to see something new for their money. So it's one of the things that the committee makes a strong point and really hopes that City Council will do, is avoid taking on new capital projects. But it's a tough sell.
Okay. John, I wanted to ask you if particularly it's harder in Portland to get a solution to the street maintenance problems. I mean, do you sense there's something different politically going on here that makes this a more intractable problem?
There are some things that are unique to Portland. Relative to other cities, say in Oregon, Portland is larger, and a lot of our advocacy organizations, whether it's the business community or it's the bike and pedestrian community, whether it's the low-income advocacy community, they're more well organized here than the other places. And when things come up, they have an opportunity to organize here and advocate here in ways that other communities aren't as effective. And especially in an environment where the community is divided on this issue, they can more effectively act as a roadblock, so to speak, perhaps than other places and other communities. But another issue is just the sense of crisis. In all my polling, certainly Portlanders agree that the roads in Portland are in need of repair. There's no doubt about that. But it's not to a level that I've seen in other communities. And just to give you an example of compare and contrast two communities, one work I've done in some Clackamas County recently, and we asked this question just to rate the quality of your roads. And in Clackamas County, 70% of the voters there said that the roads were in good and excellent condition. And in that survey, we asked a number of follow-up questions about willingness to increase taxes to fund for road maintenance. And no surprise, I suppose, there's very low support for that in a community where people feel like the roads are in good shape. In Bend, 10% of their voters said that their roads were in good and excellent condition, and their city council is putting the gas tax on the ballot. So, Portlanders think the roads are in bad condition. Do they think they're in crisis? I think part of the debate we're having would say that they're not there yet, perhaps that they will be, and as we've heard, if that's the case, that's an expensive choice to make.
Okay. Several other things on this, but one thing I do want to ask about, one thing that struck me in the report is the major impact of heavy vehicles, trucks, buses, et cetera, on the condition of the roads. Steve and maybe Jennifer, you might want to weigh in too. Do you have any solutions that sort of get at their particular impact on the roads?
So as you stated, I mean, talking about streets, they fail in different ways. So the local streets, which are 3,000 miles of our system, which is what most people live on, they fail by oxidation and weathering. They don't fail by the heavy loads. The heaviest vehicles they ever see is the garbage truck going up and down the street, and they fail very slowly. The collector arterials, they fail in a different way. They fail by the heavy loadings of trucks and vehicles. And with that, because of the heavy loads, they fail quicker, and the repair becomes deeper than if it is on a local street. And with that, as those repairs become more expensive, people notice a lot more, and it also becomes more disruptive to the public when you have to do it. One of the things I want to kind of touch on, though, is, and they just talk about this in the city report, is our issues at transportation aren't just maintenance related. They're maintenance and safety. And I think the report did a great job of highlighting that the issues we need to raise are maintenance and safety, that they go hand in hand. One of the things about Portland being a livable city is people want the walkability, they want the multimodal, they want to be safe. And as part of that, if we focus and we only did maintenance, I jokingly say if we only did maintenance, we could make it so that streets look great and everything else. But if the citizens are afraid to cross the street to go shopping or to go to transit or to let their kids go across the street to go to school, then we failed. And so we need to be able to address maintenance and safety in everything that we do. And unfortunately, those maintenance issues are primarily located in low-income areas, primarily east of 82nd Avenue. And those are in the areas where the communities are more low-income, the communities of color, and those are things that we need to try to address. So as we move forward, if funding became available, we need to address safety and maintenance as we move forward.
Do you have anything to add to that, Jennifer, particularly on the issue of heavy vehicles and reflecting their impact on the roads?
You know, we spent a lot of time talking about the, cars versus trucks versus buses, and I learned more about axles than I ever knew before. But it became apparent to me and to, I think, the rest of the committee that the roads are deteriorating from a number of reasons. It's not just because there are heavy trucks. Steve said it. The water is a big issue. We live in a wet place, and even if trucks never went down the roads, they would still deteriorate. So that's why the committee feels, I think, that the funding to fix the roads and work on safety and needs to come from everywhere, not just from one source.
One thing I want to ask about, and I think probably this might be more best directed at Steve, is when you describe the scope of the problem, it's very hard to imagine that you're going to get a solution that gives everybody in the city perfectly paved streets, sidewalks, while also dealing with safety, paying the debt service on streetcar, bridges, et cetera, given what kind of funding you're going to get realistically. Have you thought about a strategy for what you do in the absence of that? I mean, for example, do you focus on the arterials and let the neighborhood streets have a gentle return to nature, or?
Unfortunately, a lot of them are generally returning to nature as we speak. So kind of talking about that, one of the things we look at, and I'm going to talk about both the locals and the collector arterials, and again, I think it's one of those things you have to do some on both, and I'll talk about how we prioritize it. We look at the busy streets, and we look at the ones, what are the most heavily loaded, the most important ones for freight, the most important ones for transit. And from that, we try to allocate our available maintenance dollars to working on those high capacity, high freight, high transit streets, because that's where a lot of the people are and goods are moving in the city. But we can't just do, and one of the things I should mention with that is when we do the maintenance on those roads, we also address safety issues at the same time. So when we go out there to pave the street, we bring the ramps, the ADA ramps up to standard, because a lot of times they're not ADA accessible, so somebody in a wheelchair would not be able to get from the street up onto the curb. At the same time, we also try to address any signing or striping issues that we can do that would make it more multimodal, either for peds or bikes, if there's capacity, but also to try to address any other safety issues we have. But so I'd say that the primary focus, or the key, if you have to focus on things to begin with, is high priority freight and transit routes. But we also need to be doing stuff on the locals, and here's the reasons why. A lot of our locals are how the people or kids get to school and how people walk. And so we need to be encouraging and working on some of the locals in what I would say is our Safe Routes to School program, as well as our neighborhood greenways, because the Safe Routes to School program is how the kids are going to ride their bikes and get to school, and we want them to get the exercise and the health benefits that go with that. And at the same time, we want to work on our neighborhood greenways, which connect schools, parks, shops, businesses, and are where people walk and ride. And these are the types of things where we would focus our efforts on first, and that would mean some other things. If we have to prioritize, those would be the areas I'd be looking to prioritize in.
I just wanted to put a shout out to the Bureau of Transportation. One of the interesting things that the committee learned and that I was pleased to hear was that they have become really good at prioritizing and making do without a lot of money. And people talk about, I really want sidewalks in my neighborhood, and I mean, you can see that that's just not feasible. They're expensive, and there's not enough money as it is, but they're doing, they're doing some other things. We learned a lot about lowering speed limits and cleaning up shoulders, so people might not see sidewalks in the neighborhood, but they might still end up with safer streets. So they are doing a lot of things to economize and maybe meet some of those goals in cheaper ways that really impressed the committee.
Also wanted to ask about whether you see any other success stories out there, particularly, and I'm thinking these may come from outside Oregon, actually, because Portland, of course, has been pointed out, it's the largest city by far, and perhaps we're in a different situation by many of them. I have to say I've been struck as I travel around the country that you certainly see very poor streets in a lot of places. I was in New Orleans over the last Christmas break and rode a bike quite a bit around the city there, and it was, I got to tell you, it was quite jarring. I was so impressed with how smooth the streets were in Portland when I came back. And one of my colleagues who's from Mississippi looked at me levelly and said, I don't think New Orleans really ought to be our standard, but, and I thought, I don't know, in some ways I kind of like it there, but at any rate, particularly at Jennifer, did you find anything in a sort of a comparable city like Portland where you said, aha?
We looked at cities around the state. So Portland is really unique. It's bigger. A lot of times the roads are older. But one city that struck me in doing our research was Eugene, which is spending much closer to the recommended amount per lane mile for maintenance. They spend about $10,000 per lane mile, which Steve can correct me, but I think that's kind of one of the goals. And they've made some responsible choices along the way. When the state increased the vehicle registration fee, Portland, for good reasons I'm sure, spent that money on other things, and Eugene funneled that back into road maintenance to keep that at $10,000 a lane mile. They spend about 3 times what Portland does per mile on their maintenance.
Steve, go ahead.
Yeah, so one of the things we want to point out is Portland is not unique. Funding challenges for transportation are throughout the country. I mean, all you have to do is look at the federal government that hasn't been able to come to an agreement on a transportation bill in forever. I think they've had 30-something extensions, and again, it would expire, I think, again in October. And they haven't raised the federal gas tax since 1993. But if you look at the state of Oregon, I'm always interested, kind of looking around, that you find there's around 30 areas, whether it's cities or counties, that have come up with additional funding. Some of them go back as far as the 80s. LeGrand and Tualatin started funding transportation back that long ago. And I'm always kind of curious when I see that the thriving metropolises of Bay City, Clatskanie, Dufur, Dundee, Phoenix, I didn't even know there was a Phoenix, Oregon, and Talent have been able to find an alternative way to try to supplement their funding. No offense to any of those cities for the listeners who are out there, by the way. But then you do find that the Hillsboroughs and Eugenes and others have also found alternative ways to try to fund transportation. And actually with City of Eugene, without the one-time money that we got for transportation this year, their budget, if we were actually funded at Eugene's rate, our budget for pavement maintenance would quadruple. And if we were funded at City of Hillsborough's rate, not counting the one-time money we got this one year, it would triple, to give you an idea of our surrounding jurisdictions.
Well, some of you may know I'm a political reporter in my real life, and so I'm sorry, I just can't resist this asking this question to John, probably the one person here who's really free to answer this, and that is, do you see this as a major issue in the upcoming mayor's race, and what do you think of this statement in Ted Wheeler's announcement of his candidacy this week? Do we want endless pledges on fixing roads and making City Hall function, or do we want progress?
Well, absolutely, I would expect it to be a major issue. The mayor, when he was running, he ran on a platform of back to the basics and going to fix the potholes. And the last few years, this has been a major conversation in Portland. And so it would make perfect sense that both Mayor Hales will run on his record of transportation, and that the challenger, Ted Wheeler, would also run to have that discussion as well. That is perfectly appropriate and makes sense. How much the debate revolves around process and how much it revolves around mechanisms for funding, I think will be both telling for both candidates and how they want to proceed. Well, frankly, it's relatively easy to say I would have done things different in the past or I will do things different in the future, and that's meaningful. It tells voters who they are and how they'll work, and it signals lots of important things. I'll say in my polling that I've done, there is definitely belief that roads in Portland are in poor repair. There's a belief that we need more money to fix them. How much money and the mechanisms to pay for it are highly contested, as we've seen over the last couple of years. I would hope, as a voter, that that's part of the debate, and each candidate will make their pitch and about how we should move forward, and I expect it to be.
Okay, well, here's to having the candidates someday discuss that very issue right up here on stage. I have a little script now. We're going to go into the audience Q&A section. I can just see this group here. I know radio listeners can't see it, but there are people chomping at the bit and who have quite a bit of expertise and interest in this issue. So I've got to say a few standard things here. As we open the Q&A portion of the program, if you've written a question on an index card, please hold it up high so that city staff, club staff can collect it from you. And we will take questions from the audience by inviting members of the city club to the microphone to ask their question. And asking questions at the Friday Forum microphone is a benefit of city club membership, and membership is open to everyone. Okay, there's the ad. Before asking your question, please identify yourself as a city club member and ask your question in 30 seconds or less. And also, I will read at least one index card question.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. I worked for the City of Portland back in the 80s under Bud Clark, and we had a shortage money problem. We put through a utility fee increase that was passed on to each and every person inside the City of Portland. It would even show up as city tax, like on your PGE bill. And that's how we raised money. The utilities gathered it for us, because they did already, and gave it to us quarterly. And then to help with the low-income people, we used the state's food stamp program to decide who should get rebates. Have you looked into doing something simple like this? It's equitable, because if you're not buying as much electricity, you're probably not as rich as someone else.
Steve or Jennifer, either of you want to take that?
Sure. The committee looked at that in depth, and in fact, that's the one issue of disagreement. So try not to put my hat on as part of the minority here and say we looked at it. A lot of the objection to that idea is that it's actually really difficult to target people who need to get a rebate, because more of those folks live in multifamily housing units, and so that the bill, their water bill is going to their landlord, not to them specifically. So there are some administrative challenges. And a flat fee like that has not proven to be very popular.
John, did you have
I was just going to say, last couple of years was probably a particularly difficult environment to do in part what you were saying, when in that the obvious collection mechanism in the city of Portland would be the sewer and water bill. And there are a lot of politics wrapped up in the city over the last couple of years about sewer and water, the increases, who should control, and all that. So it was a particularly difficult environment, I think, as a tool to collect the tax in Portland.
Yeah, one thing I'd say about it is, I think when we kind of talk about things, there's normally not a silver bullet out there. If there was a silver bullet out there, I think everybody would have found it and jumped on it. But one of the things we kind of talk about is looking for what we call silver buckshot, in that it's kind of the scattergun effect, and you try to do things in multiple ways. So, that's what I think people are probably looking at, is probably more the silver buckshot of trying to do raise money in a variety of different ways. If you kind of think about it, it's kind of like you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket. You always hear that about investment. I'd say it's the same thing here.
Okay, next.
Edward Hershey, City Club member. My question also relates to equity, and it has two parts. Steve, you mentioned that the neediest areas in terms of street maintenance are east of 82nd and that the priorities for the most used streets in terms of budgeting, given that the people who live east of 82nd have often been displaced there by gentrification or can only afford to live there, given that the homeowners and landlords in that area often have a greater share of the tax burden, both because of a quirk in the tax laws as well as diversion from previous urban renewal districts, shouldn't we prioritize those areas as a matter of equity, first of all? And second of all, if we do that and say that, given the nature of Portland as a progressive place that votes for things like schools and libraries and arts, isn't that a good sell to the electorate that this is an equity issue?
So building on a couple things, if you look at what the Our Streets proposal was that we had, we were addressing the safety issues, which are primarily east of 82nd, because as we said, primarily east of 82nd, the pedestrian fatality rate is, I think it's over twice as high as the rest of the city. And one of the things the city, we're looking at the Our Streets proposal on the maintenance side was we were saying, look, we have these 10 high crash corridors throughout the city, and they're primarily east of 82nd. I mean, they're actually 82nd, 122nd, Barber, and there's others as well. Was trying to focus the safety on those areas, because one of the things about it, if the citizens don't feel safe, they don't want to cross the street, right? So they're concerned to go catch the bus, to send their kids to cross the street to go to school, and it starts affecting livability, because if people if they're worried about these safety issues, they're going to look for alternative modes, which in some cases means if they have a car, they drive, and a lot of them don't have that option. And if we don't address those things, we affect the livability of the city of Portland and the safety. So if you look at the Our Streets proposal that we had for safety, it was primarily to address those safety issues that you brought up in East Portland.
Okay, next.
Stephen Lynn, City Club member. The city is surrounded with a lot of distribution centers for major manufacturers, the grocery industry, and the transportation industry. How are we going to capture the usage for the roads by those that are outside the city of Portland?
I'm actually going to let Jennifer did an excellent job in this report, so I'm going to let Jennifer talk about how they address this in their report.
Well, one of the ways that it could be addressed is through some kind of a transportation utility fee where there's a business component and a residential component. And I'm happy to talk more about that when I make my pitch for the minority position in the report.
Okay.
Okay. Hi, Sonia Montalbano. I'm a City Club member. There is a significant amount of both residential and commercial construction going on throughout the city of Portland. You look around, the sky is filled with cranes. That is going to obviously increase the number of people that are going to be coming in and using the city roads. There are also a significant number of tax breaks that are being given to developers to entice them to develop in the city. And I wonder to what extent the report addresses the possibility of eliminating those tax breaks, increasing our tax revenues, and applying those towards the transportation budget.
All right, Jennifer, I think you're the one on the...
Well, I think, I'm not an expert on development fees, but my understanding is that developers do pay fees, and some of them are allocated to making transportation improvements, and so I think that's already happening. I don't know that any of that money, well, I'm pretty certain, and Steve, you can correct me here, I don't think any of that money is then put aside to maintain infrastructure later. But I do believe that developers are required to make improvements when they build new construction.
I don't know if I can answer this question, but maybe it's a good chance just for me to say what we've seen when we've asked Portland voters what sorts of mechanisms are more or less favorable. We have not asked about those sorts of charges. The amount of revenue they can raise, I don't know, and whether it'd be sufficient to pursue it as a means. But we've tested things like a sales tax, as you can imagine. That doesn't do well here in Oregon. All right, we know the experience with street fee. It's a contested issue. It depends on the polling. Maybe you get to 50, 55% in the last year. A gas tax, again, probably around 50% is where Portland voters would start on that question. And we've tested a progressive income tax, and that does best out of all the things that I've tested so far. But even that, you get to about 60%. And as someone who works in this sort of political world a lot, 60% is the bare threshold you really think about as a number that you want to start with to feel confident that you can be successful going forward. Maybe just back to my point earlier is that there's not an obvious answer in the public about the best means or mechanisms to fund these sorts of costs.
So one thing I would say about that is on those types of buildings, we do collect a systems development charge. And those systems development charge, and that's what it is to try to capture the impact that those buildings and the people will have on the systems. And we've collected systems development charges that we could use to go address some issues, but the fact of the matter has been, with those systems development charges, you need to have a match to be able to complete the project. And we have not had the resources to actually come up with a match to be able to utilize some of those systems development charges we've gathered.
I want to ask one question from one of the cards in the audience, and I thought it was an interesting point, and I really want to make sure we get to it. And that's about a statewide transportation package. Whether any of you have any hopes that the legislature may enact something in the February 2016 session, and what kind of impact that would have on Portland's street maintenance problem. First with you, Steve.
The last thing I'm going to do is call myself a political pundit. So whether the legislature will pass something or not, I don't know. If they did, depending upon what they did, that would obviously, if revenue came to Portland, help address some of our needs. And again, our needs are both safety and maintenance. I think a lot of times we only talk about the maintenance side, but we need to make sure that we address the safety issues, especially for folks in some of these high crash corridor or underserved areas. But again, that would definitely be a step forward. But if you look at the history of the state, we've had, and the way they've typically funded transportation in Oregon has been through gas tax, and there's been one gas tax increase since 1993. So we'll see.
How about John first and Jennifer?
I've been gaming this out in my own head over the last year, how this might play out. And my sense is that being cynical about how politics work, that Portland in the short term may have been benefited by the state not acting, in that if the state had acted, Portland voters may have felt that the problem was being taken care of. To the extent that Portland voters need to feel like there's a crisis that they have to act on, I think it's more likely that they'll make that choice to do that for themselves, that they feel like they're rescued from the outside by an amount of money that was not going to be nearly sufficient to meet our needs. If that would have made them feel like the problem had been taken care of, I think it would have made them less likely that we would have acted here locally. That's tough to figure out, but that's what my gut says.
I just wanted to say that I think money from the state falls into Steve's category of silver buckshot. I'm sure it would have been nice, but when we were tracking the proposals in the state legislature, best case scenario, they would have added up to tens of millions of dollars for Portland, when what we're talking about is hundreds of millions of dollars each year. So, I mean, it might be nice, and I hope that they do send us a little bit of money, but on the flip side, we can't count on that to solve the problem.
Well, while we're talking about buckshot, and I don't know if this really involves silver buckshot or maybe just the old-fashioned lead kind, but one questioner asked whether non-traditional users of Portland streets, that's an interesting choice of words, such as car-sharing services, taxi alternatives like Uber, and cyclists should pay something that they're not paying now. Any thoughts on that, Jennifer? Did you look at that?
Sure. Well, I think the taxi services, the Ubers, are all, if we raise the gas tax, they're going to pay more gas tax. We didn't look at specifically taxing a particular industry. They're going to pay vehicle registration fees. We talked about raising those, and those fees would be captured from those kinds of services. Bicyclists, I kind of hate to talk about because everyone has really strong feelings about it. One of the things the committee discussed, and this was one of the points that the minority raises in its support of some kind of a transportation utility fee, is that people who solely bike would pay something for the streets in their transportation utility fee. So it would capture those non-traditional users by charging everybody who lives in the city some modest amount for the privilege of having a functional transportation system.
Okay, let's return to the microphone. Next.
Wynn Wakala, City Club member. I wanted to clarify, we had a Citizens Revenue Task Force Committee, and what they came up with was currently, I think it's between 5 and 7% right now are charged to the utilities. We're talking PGE, telephones, Northwest Gas, everybody, not just the city utilities. We added an extra percent. So if your bill was $100 before, now it would be 101. So we added an extra percent. And another source of revenue we came up with for an idea was a real estate transfer fee. You might check those out.
Okay, thank you. Next.
Virginia Cornyn, City Club member. I like the metaphor of silver buckshot. My question is to land on the largest piece of buckshot being gas tax when the stated city philosophy is to move away from driving toward public transportation and bicycles seems counterintuitive. Can you explain why that was the top choice?
So one of the goals that we had for whatever mechanism we chose was that it was in some fashion related to use of the streets. So if the mechanism is completely unrelated, then you have no incentive to use the resources less. So if everyone pays the same amount no matter what, my incentive is to drive. So a gas tax is a really imperfect and increasingly more imperfect measure of your use of city streets. We looked at vehicle miles traveled technology, which would capture those people who are buying more efficient cars, electric cars, but it's in a pilot program right now. It's not something that we could recommend and expect that there would be any revenue coming from it right now. I guess the bottom line is that a gas tax, it was an imperfect proxy for taxing people's actual use of the streets.
Okay, next.
Hi, I'm Shannon Carney. I'm a City Club member. My question comes from, so initially, when we started talking about this topic, you shared that your initial reaction to a street fee was that you felt that, that paving roads was a pretty basic function of government and that you would expect that that would sort of be taken care of. And I think in that context, I was a little surprised with how rapidly the report dismissed the possibility of reprioritizing existing city funding to this, street maintenance and paving. And I was just curious what your process was for considering that as an option, and if that might be a possibility, and if you actually considered cutting other services that we currently provide.
Sure, we looked at that as a whole, but again, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room there. The amounts that the city has to work with that's discretionary in that way is between, I think, $400 and $500 million a year. And what we're looking for transportation is $200 million. That doesn't mean there can't be some, incremental improvements along the way. And in the report, we looked at a lot of the popular targets, the mounted police, the streetcar. And when you look at them, they really are kind of a drop in the bucket. But the committee did recommend that the city, take a hard look at the budget and make some tough choices. And one of the things that we recommended and the city is doing is, plowing any of the surplus that they can into streets. And they've done that this year, and I hope that they continue to do it again.
Hold on, I got to stop you there because I think this is something that people are really very interested in when you said a streetcar is a drop in the bucket. Maybe Steve can explain a little bit about the funding of the streetcar. And of course, we have it, so the streetcar is out of the barn, so to speak. But talk a little bit about funding for the streetcar and what kind of impact that's had on maintenance in the city.
Yeah, so let's talk about a couple things. I mean, the streetcar system, we actually utilize TriMet's drivers to actually run the system. And if you look at the streetcar operations, as you said, I mean, of our budget of $300 million, I can't remember the number off the top of my head, but it's 3 million, 4 million, 4 million. So when you look at it, it's like 1 3/10% of our budget to run the streetcar on an annual basis. So it's a very small amount of money.
What about the capital cost? Has that affected maintenance by deciding to do the streetcar?
Probably a little bit. I mean, again, the vast majority of the money came from the federal grants and plus local improvement district that was paid, that the adjacent or surrounding property owners paid for. So there wasn't a lot of city money into the project to begin with.
Thanks. Okay, next question.
Hi, Bobby Regan, City Club member. There's at least a little bit of irony in the title of this report, which is Portland Streets Ending the Funding Gridlock, because I think what a lot of people in Portland are experiencing is just traffic gridlock and how much time we are spending now just sitting. So when you look at the majority recommendation number 5, the city should adopt an ironclad fix-it-first policy, prioritizing maintenance and safety over new capital expenditures. Was there any discussion by the committee about the gridlock that we're all experiencing and how to deal with that?
You know, we didn't look at gridlock specifically. I think that recommendation came out of a discussion we had with some economists who might be in or may not be in the room. And the example that he used in illustrating this to the committee was the Columbia River crossing. So I understand that's not part of the city and it's a totally different jurisdiction, but bear with me. He said that when they did polling about what people were willing to pay in a toll, the support for the bridge completely fell off. So when people were asked to pay what amounted to a third of the cost of maintaining the bridge, everyone said, forget it, we won't do it. We'll drive around 205 and we'll avoid the toll. And so the takeaway from that is if the people who are using it don't value that transportation resource in a way that's commensurate with what it costs the city, then we shouldn't build it. If it's not important enough to pay $4 to drive across the bridge, it's not important enough to build it. If there's gridlock and it's impacting all of our lives and we're miserable, then we need to be willing to put some money into the problem and pay for that. But you can't keep taking the money away from existing streets to build new things if there's no money to maintain the new things and repair the old ones.
Okay, I think we're to about the last question, and I see somebody else at the microphone there.
Hi, my name is Tony Tabora Roberts. I'm a City Club member. I am pretty new to this topic, and so there's a lot of complex sort of mathematics and equations that you kind of have to put together to get at least some of the funding that is needed for the street maintenance. But I guess my question and the thing that has resonated with me is the sense of urgency maybe is not there for the general public, people like me who don't necessarily know a lot. So what would you maybe from the committee point of view, but maybe each of the panelists, what would you say is the one thing you would take away from this report or from this conversation for the general public to kind of just get that sense of urgency?
I'm going to tell a quick story. One of the things is when we do preventative maintenance, by spending money now, we save probably $5 down the road. And a lot of times when we do a street, we get the phone calls that said, what idiot decided to pave that street? This next one down the street's a whole lot worse. And when I get that phone call, I normally say, Mom, it's okay. We made the right decision. We're doing asset management. We're doing preventative maintenance. And by spending this way, I'm able to get 10 miles done, as opposed to if I fix that broken road, I'd get 1 mile done, and then what happens, those other 9 miles I didn't get a touch keep getting worse. So I think it's one of the things is trying to educate the public, because it's not intuitively obvious that by doing preventive maintenance to try to keep things from getting worse, you're actually doing the right thing. Because the public thinks, and I can understand why, the motto I always hear from the public is, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But because of the way the costs increase, if we wait till it's broke, we will go broke fixing it.
Okay, John, real quick.
I just want to add political leadership. If you look at the report, we've gone through a long period of time without investing in these roads in the way that we should. The easy thing would have been for the commissioner and the mayor and council to have done nothing again. So the fact that they've taken these steps, there's been lots of controversy, there's been lots of debate, but we're here, we're having that debate, we're having these difficult conversations. And the easy thing would have been for them to have not done anything. And so political leadership is clearly moving this conversation forward, and it needs to be there to continue to do so.
Okay, thank you. I think it's time to hand it back to the president.
We've run out of broadcast time for further questions. We'll have to end our regular Friday forum now. This is Greg McPherson, President of City Club. Please join me in thanking today's panel. If you're a City Club